All right, testing. 1, 2, 3. Testing. 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 1, 2, 3. Something is wrong. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Somebody messed with the sound system again. Okay. Testing, testing, testing. Okay, that's on. This is on. Hello, 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 hello. Hello, hello. All right. Can you guys hear this okay? Because somebody, I can't figure out what microphone, what volume. They always... Okay, how about now? Well, no, it was. I hear feedback. Okay, somebody messed with my mic. Honest to God, I didn't turn it on. Anyhow, it's a little loud. Okay, so Nico Kazanakis, famous writer. Anyhow, he writes his autobiography, and he said, when he was younger, he was very devoted. He would go to daily mass. His mother would go to daily mass, except his dad was this hard, iconoclastic, atheist father. So, in all honesty, he said, I always had problems with religion growing up, but as a young man, he spends the summer visiting the monks at Mount Athos, because he was thinking about becoming a monk. And he met this old monk spiritual director, Father Macarius, who was an incredibly holy man. But he said all he had left was his eyes. And the monk said to Nico, he said, what are you looking for? And Nico said, I want some spiritual advice. You are in your 80s. And he says, are you still wrestling with the devil? And the old monk said, no, honestly, I don't. I used to wrestle with the devil, but when I was younger, I wrestled with Satan. But as I've grown older and tired, Satan has grown old and tired as well. And he said, the two of us are like two prize fighters who have learned just to avoid each other and leave each other alone. So then the young Nico says, so you're at peace? And he says, no. Father Macarius says, I'm not at peace. Now I no longer wrestle with Satan, I wrestle with God. And that's a lot harder. He says, I hope to lose this fight. And I just want to repeat that he said in his younger years, he wrestled with the devil. But in his old age, he wrestles with God. And in some sense, I think that's a metaphor that divides the two halves of life. Now, actually, I'd say there's three phases in life. But I think the last phase in life, who you really wrestle with is the devil. You have different spiritualities. If we look at the story of Jacob, too. There's different spiritualities for different time periods of life. You need one spirituality when you're younger, but you need a completely different one when you're older. When you're in your younger years, our lives are a struggle with all these fiery energies of youth, which I call wrestling with the devil. But at a certain point, those aren't really the struggle anymore. The second half of life is a struggle with bitterness and forgiveness, and the mercies of wasted time. You're not struggling with the devil, you're struggling with God. And the two halves of life are kind of like the parable of the prodigal son, which really should be, prodigal means generous. That's misnamed. It should be named the parable of the prodigal father. He's the one who's generous. And rather than think of the story about two different people, think about the story as the story of one person, but at different times of your life. We're both the two sons in the parable, and the prodigal father is God. The younger son, he spends his youth in drunkenness and partying and waste, all the sins of youth. And he finds himself out of his father's house due to his own weaknesses. And so he has to search for his father. The older son just might represent the older version of you, who doesn't protest, doesn't really do anything wrong. He's not out doing anything wrong, but he finds himself equally outside the Father's house. But he's outside the Father's house because of his own bitterness and anger and judgmentalism. Those are the sins in the second half of life. That there's a difference, that we can find ourselves not completely within God's house for different reasons. different struggles in the spiritual life. Somebody once said, I spent the first half of my life wrestling with the sixth commandment, and then we spend the first half of life wrestling with the sixth commandment, and we spend the second half of our life wrestling with the fifth commandment, thou shalt not kill. And we kill off others through harsh judgment, through bitterness. We murder joy in our own heart. And so Henry Nouwen said, no one is shot by a gun who is not first shot by a word. And nobody is shot by a word until they've shot by a thought. Who is he? Who does that person think that they are? Does that make any, those are the internal struggles. And this sounds strange. I have found that in confession. Because when you listen to confession of younger people, they are kind of the same sins. When you listen to older people, the sins are far more internal. Nobody's they can come into confession and say, well, I'm really not doing anything wrong, except they're struggling with resentment or bitterness or, all those internal struggles. Does that make sense? That's what I'd say is really wrestling with God. You're not really doing, breaking any of the Ten Commandments. There's just this great struggle within yourself. And so how does the different seasons of our lives interface with our spirituality? Now, the odd part is there's a few retreats that work on the spirituality of aging, but it's really pretty rare. And the hard part about the spirituality of aging is that this is not a systematic theology. And if you're just wondering, okay, what is a systematic theology? A systematic theology is teaching theology through kind of like memorized rules and answers. What are the 4 marks of the Catholic Church? What is this? It's a very organized, one-size-fits-all theology. Does that make any sense? So that's like how you have to teach to children. But it never really speaks about the issues of life. Now, oddly enough, if you notice, Christ never teaches by a systematic theology. And it doesn't work in the second half of life. Pat can know the 5 marks of the Catholic Church, but how does that help her in whatever spiritual struggles, you know what I mean? So the odd part is that you have to kind of have a non-systematic spirituality. And have you ever noticed, I noticed this, how I heard the gospel at one time in my life, I hear it completely different at another. I love the 23rd Psalm. I love the 23rd Psalm. When it says that you'll have a banquet in the sight of your foes? When I was in my 30s, I interpret that I am going to dominate you people. One day I will win. But later in life, a banquet with my foes is not, I don't want to dominate anybody. I want to convert my foes into friends. So, I won't have any enemies because I would have learned how to love them. That makes sense only later in life. So you hear the gospel differently depending on your age. A 20-year-old hears it differently than an 80-year-old. And a 50-year-old who's just been diagnosed with cancer is going to hear it a lot different than a 20-year-old that feels so powerful in life. So when Christ says, if you wish to be my disciple, pick up your cross and follow me, that means one thing to a 9-year-old, and it means something completely to a parent who's been told that they only have 9 months to live. So my point being is that it takes a non-systemized spirituality. Or the parable of the talents means one thing to a teenager, something much different to an 80-year-old. And with each new phase of life comes its own spirituality. You see the same things, but in a completely new way. To me, it's always like that opening of Dante's Inferno. Halfway through my life, I found myself in a dark forest. I found myself going in a completely different direction. And you discover that you need a new type of spirituality at the last phase of life. At what worked at one point of your life, that spirituality won't work at the last. And so, I have to admit, for me, and I'm only really 60, I've lost my systemized theology. Do this, and you're guaranteed this. Like that worked at one point in my life, but I find it a waste of time. Or I was at this other priest parish. He's a pastor there, and he is into imposing rules. Rules would be a systemized spirituality, where everything is rules, and everybody in his parish is walking on eggshells. Most of them are these liturgical rules, and I know, believe it or not, I know when I'm breaking it, but I know liturgy. And they'd be like, oh, liturgically, did you know you're not supposed to do X, Y, Z? That is not in the rubrics. He made that up. Does that make sense? Like, he's always kind of making up these rules, so everybody's kind of walking in fear, and like, oh my gosh, I really want. And that's, I guess, okay. He wants order. But the problem with that is that it doesn't really speak to your life. I can't have that spirituality late at life. It gives no life. It doesn't celebrate what's most important in the Eucharist, is the fact that people are dressed. No sleeveless shirts for women. Men can wear like slobs. All those rules. It doesn't really define. It doesn't help the Eucharist celebrate this great conversion. It's all about the superficial. That spirituality works for a young pastor who wants conformity. But I'm not really into those kind of systemizations. It works with children. It doesn't work with anybody past 60. So what motivates you at one point in your spirituality might not work later on in life. Just because you've kept the rules perfectly doesn't mean that you win. That's a systemized spirituality. I've obeyed every single rule, so I win. That's a really, really sad spirituality. So when I meet middle-aged people working out of that, I always think it's really sad. Granted, when you're young, you were taught the great mysteries by memorized catechism. No problem with that. But working off that pattern of reward and punishment, rather than entering into the mystery of God, it doesn't work when you're older. In the teenage psyche, it's like the teenage psyche of the question of, am I cute? Am I loved? And then you apply that to the spiritual life. I'm loved because I've kept all the rules and regulations. It's a dangerous spirituality because what it wants is a homostatic life, a spirituality that involves no change. But if your view of life and God and prayer, it should be perfected as you age. It's kind of like the view of your parents. Like I'm going to go pick up my mother after class. I'm heading off to Montana. But I was shocked years ago when my grandmother died because my mother, she likes to write her own Stations of the Cross. So she wrote her own Stations of the Cross to get over losing her mother. And I said, oh, well, that's kind of neat. Why? And she says, because I've got to learn how to forgive my mother. And I said, like, that made no sense to me. And I said, Grandma worshipped you. My grandmother loved my mother, and my mother loved my grandmother. And so I said, well, what do you have to forgive? And she says, well, I loved my mother, but she wasn't perfect. I have no idea what she was talking about. But she says, and later when I die, I hope that you'll forgive me for the ways in which I wasn't perfect. Well, I loved my mother at that time in my life. Later in life, I was able to pick out her faults. But here's the thing, is that as adults, you realize no parent is perfect, that they have their faults. But I don't have any resentments about it. At the end of life, you discover, well, they weren't perfect, but they were good. You can love them despite their faults. Does that make any sense? This sounds kind of strange. I want to love my mother not as I did as a child. I want to love my mother as she is, and I am, as two aged people. I want to love her as an elder. To say that you don't want your understanding of God to change, your understanding of other people to change, that you have the catechism memorized, that's really refusing the paschal mystery, to die and rise again. The opposite of that spirituality, the spirituality of journeying, that, I'm going to see my mother differently at different ages. That's the opposite of the journey spirituality. And if you notice, God takes Abraham, Isaac, Moses, the entire people of God on a journey. So they're never the same. We're not meant to see God or each other the same. And so spirituality of aging means, no, I don't want the spirituality that I did as a 20-year-old or middle-aged. And this one bishop was in a news conference where he was a very harsh, rule-based bishop. And he comes out in his parish and says that now they're going to have girl altar servers. And somebody at the conference says, you said 20 years ago when you became bishop that there'll never be girl altar servers in your parish. And the bishop's answer back was, you're going to quote to me something I said 20 years ago? I'm not the same person. Maybe I've discovered that I was wrong. And I just love when the bishop said that. That really you have to wrestle with things. And a lot of people want everything to stay the same. They have the answers. But here's the thing. Did you know Christ in the gospel asks a question 183 times, but only 3 times does he actually answer a question? Christ asks a lot more questions than he does give answers. Christ asks us to become elders, not just old. Now, there's a difference between being old and being an elder. Christ asks us to become an elder by asking a lot of questions. Our religion, like Jesus, doesn't really give us answers. It teaches us a way of life. It teaches us to listen and question. So this class is obviously not for some, because it'll sound like doublespeak. Well, I want some clear answers. But if you're 60 and still working up the spirituality that you need to be right, to be satisfied, then John of the Cross would say, you've never entered the dark night of the soul, and God can't lead you to a deeper spirituality. The prayer life, if your prayer life is that of intelligent briefings telling God, this is what I need you to do, that's the spirituality of somebody in their, no offense, Middle Ages. It's completely different. An old man who's praying next to his ailing wife as she's dying, he's not telling God what to do. His prayer life is just making him more loving and more present to the love of his life, not to change the will of God. Does that make any sense? So there's a difference. And most of us, I think, resist grace. Flannery O'Connor once said, all humans resist grace because grace is change. Very few people can be like the Virgin Mary or St. Therese of Lisieux, that at all times of their life were open to grace. And the most surrendering to grace, I actually think, is in the 3rd phase of life. So as I said, I'm going to work up that there's 3 phases of life. And if you look at the mystics, like St. John of the Cross, he's very intellectual, very structured, or Julian, very heart-centered. They always divide the spiritual life into 3 phases. So, I like John the Cross, so we're going to look at how John the Cross divides up the spiritual life. And he describes spiritual life as a journey through a dark night. So, life on earth is a dark night. Heaven is the bright day. Does that make sense? So, everything's a night. And he says the first phase of life is the night of senses. And we pass through a journey of the world of senses. This is a time in your childhood where you start to make vows and fall in love, but you're taken up with the senses of the world. And it's a struggle to get our life together. And then he said the second phase is the night of proficiency, which I like that. The night of proficiency is when you start to make commitments to take care of somebody other than just yourself. You get married, you have children, you become a parent, a teacher, somebody's aunt, somebody's uncle, somebody's AA sponsor. Okay, that was a joke. Nobody laughed at that. But John the Cross says you're getting responsibilities. And so he says you're becoming a proficient. You're becoming proficient at something and being responsible for more than just yourself. At the dark night of the senses, you're just taken up with your own senses. You're at the center of your world. When you become proficient, you become responsible. So you start to do ministry, you have your car keys, the church keys, the pantry keys, and 4 other things that you need to get to before lunch. But he says that's a type of spiritual awakening, that you're no longer the center of your life. Because you're a parent, you have these other things. And like I have to say, I can't tell you how many times in confession somebody has said, I was spending my life partying and drinking, and then this little girl was born. And, there's a spiritual awakening. He's becoming a proficient. And there's a great joy there. The third phase of life is what he calls the dark night of the soul. And that's the final phase. And this sounds strange. Like the proficient phase, you give away your proficiency. You take care of other people. And the final phase, the dark night of the soul, is you learning, how do I give away my death? That's why it's called the dark night of the soul. And we could use a variety of scriptural issues to highlight this, but one I like to use is the story of Mary and Martha. But once again, think about this. Instead of thinking it as 2 different individuals, think of it as one individual at different phases of their life. Martha is proficient. She's busy with many things. Mary is not. Mary's just sitting there with Christ. And Martha is taking care of everything. And she says to Jesus at one point, doesn't that bother you? And I love how Jesus says, no, it doesn't. So think about this. Maybe the last phase of our life is not to be proficient, but to become a Mary. Our final stage is just to be still with Christ. Now, I do have a little bit of a problem when priests give homilies to the entire congregation that you just need to be still with Jesus. I do believe that. But like this one priest gave the homily where he quoted like Mother Teresa, who said, you don't have to be successful. You just have to be faithful. And he quoted Henry Nouwen, who said, success can be a cancer. Don't lean on success. Learn to just be still with Christ. I have to say, I believe that. But there's a point in our discipleship where it's not about what you're doing, but just becoming who you are. Now, that homily about just being still with Christ, that's for somebody in the third phase of the spirituality, not the second. From our teenage years on, most people are struggling to build a self-image by achieving success. I have a problem with teenagers who aren't struggling to build a sense of self-image by trying something. Sitting around video games is not going to help your self-esteem. You need to get out there. And so you struggle to build a self-image of self-worth by accomplishments of doing things, achieving, being proficient, being a Martha. We get degrees, we have kids, we win Super Bowls. Later in life, those successes will not be the source of your deep identity. Many people struggle with a sense of self-worth by achieving, and that's okay. But Mother Teresa, John Vianney, and Henry Nouwen, at the end of their life, stopped trying to achieve. And all they wanted to be was a child of God. And so this priest, when he gives this homily, where he says, you just need to be still with God, after Mass, a parishioner questioned him on it. And he said, there's only stillness after you've achieved something. And he says, people like to tell you, success is not important, but they're always successful when they say that. He says, I have a picture of Mother Teresa getting off the plane in Stockholm, who's accepted the Nobel Prize in her hands, and says, you really don't need to do anything. She got the Nobel Prize because she was taking care of the poor. Does that make sense? She was proficient in her love. Does that make sense? Henry Nouwen speaks a lot about becoming still. after he wrote 60 books and was pursued by Harvard and Yale, who both wanted him to teach. He only became just being still with God after he had some proficiency. How do you have a sense of self-worth if you're a big fat nobody? And the priest tried to argue with the guy, but then finally the priest folded and he says, you're right. That homily was meant for people only in the dark night of the soul. It wasn't really meant for others. No, I'm not saying the homily was bad, but there's different phases of life. And my mother, and I love my mother, but holy cow, she was so strict growing up. You wouldn't believe. There's no negotiating with that woman. No, seriously, there was none. And so my sister and my mother, when the boys were growing up, lived side by side, which is great because, when you're a kid, you could have dinner at Nana's, that is always at 5:30, or you can have dinner at my sister's house whenever the sports gets over. Does that make any sense? It was kind of a compound. But it was weird to see my mother as a Nana because, my mother didn't allow sugar in the house when we were growing up. On your birthday, you could have a cake, but you're not having fancy cereals. You're eating vegetables. She was so strict. Nana now, ice cream every night for the grandkids. She kind of shocked me and said, I was intent on being a good mother, but I did my time. I put him, anyhow, I can guarantee you, my mother never said to us growing up, you're fine just the way you are. Nana has she is so in love with her grandchildren, you're just great just the way you are. I never heard that. No, that's not resentment. But my point being is that being still with Jesus, that's a third phase spirituality. I think the middle-aged people, they need to struggle. By middle age, I mean 20 on. You need to become proficient. So this one girl at Holy Apostles, love her, she took the confirmation name from Mother Teresa. So, I'm just curious why. And so I said, well, why'd you take the name Mother Teresa? And she said, because Mother Teresa did so much to take care of other people. And she says, that's what I want to be. And that's true. Mother Teresa did do that in her second phase of life. But in her last phase of life, she just wanted to do adoration and be at peace. And I hope this girl who took her name, I hope she becomes proficient like Mother Teresa, caring for other people. I also hope when she's 80, she becomes like Mother Teresa, who just wants stillness with God. So that whole point is that there's different phases of spirituality. No offense, if you're in the 60 or 70, why do you want a spirituality of a middle-aged person? So the three phases. The essential phase is the struggle to get our lives together. The second phase is the generative phase, where we struggle to give our lives away. That's what Jesus did for most of the gospel, is Jesus in the generative phase. He's giving his life away. And the third phase is called radical discipleship. And that's when you learn to give your death away. So starting with the Passion on, the Lord's Supper on, what Jesus struggles with is not the generative phase. Jesus gives his death away. So just going over that again, the essential phase, and I'm going to mention this, a child is initiated into a community, into a religion. So think of baptism. A child is initiated to say please and thank you, how to take care of itself. And then puberty hits with violence. And our happy little kids become junior high kids, and they're moody, and parents are an embarrassment. And nature heats up so that they'll go off and find each other and make their own ways and make their own homes. They go to college. They look for a job. They're looking for identity. That's what the old monk Macarius said was wrestling with the devil. So I picture the devil being this fury of the energy that can sidetrack us into self-absorption. And there is a danger there. But then there's another initiation. Initiation really into adulthood. And this sounds kind of strange, but a lot of ancient cultures, liturgically, had rites of initiation for young people into adults. And the purpose of the initiation was designed that at a certain point, the child has to die. And die to being just self-absorbed, the center of their own world, and be part of the community. Now, believe it or not, we have that also in Catholicism, confirmation, where we anoint and pray over these kids that their life has a purpose. It's time for you to offer your gift to the world for the rest of your lives. So we have these initiation rites, baptism into a community, confirmation that, no, you have to put something on the table. You have a gift to offer to care for other people. But think about this. Culturally, we have that in the Catholic Church. But as a society, as Americans, what do we have now? You hold your breath, hoping that no terrible mistakes are made until they learn to master these energies. Look at the initiation that our culture has. Prom, huge amounts of money that's spent on turning a young boy, going on his date, really, or girl. I don't know. Have you guys seen proms lately? Honest God, huge, mega, thousands of dollars spent on proms. It doesn't initiate them into adulthood. It initiates them into becoming more self-absorbed. Or the other one, very popular, I went through this, is drinking. At Grants Pass, where my sister and my mother live, all the teenage boys get heavily into drinking, right? I have to admit I was there too. But up on the mountain, they'll put the letters in these white logs of any, and there's always one up there, some kid who died from drinking too much. And we're walking around the neighborhood, and my sister stops, and she's with we're walking with two of her teenage boys, and says, let me tell you, I'm going to be pissed if I ever look up and see your initials on that mountain. I expect better of you. Does that make sense? Yeah. Initiation into adulthood is not that you can be incredibly stupid with a night of drinking. Not that we've all done stupid things. But that's how we supposedly initiate into adulthood, is by these ridiculous acts. And if you look at the ancient rites of initiating, a community had to make sure you don't always stay a child. And some of these initiation rites bordered on dying. They could be brutal, sometimes end up accidentally killing them. But children have to be pushed into responsibility to the edge of dying. So these ancient societies couldn't afford members who just lived for themselves. You have to contribute to the members. So in each initiation, there's a death so that you can take on the next phase of life. Now, we don't really have, as a culture, any formal initiations. But we have all these informal ones, drinking. Thousands of children die in stupid car accidents, driving, drugs, falling out of fraternity windows. Those are kind of self-initiating rites of initiation. It's dangerous to have full-grown adults working around that is nothing more than a man-baby. A society has to kind of channel those excess energies into adulthood. So I could go off on stats on that, but I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip a lot of that. But no, really, you have these man-babies walk around. Does that make sense? So just because you're 30 doesn't mean you're not a man-baby. So you have these initiations from childhood to adulthood. And here's my point. Where am I going with this? Well, the same way we have these rights to move from childhood to adulthood, to avoid the man-babies walking around our country, shouldn't we have some sort of initiation rite that moves people from just being old into becoming an elder? And there's a difference between just being old and being an elder. It's the same difference between being a man-baby and being a 30-year-old who's responsible. 30-year-old technically is an adult, but are they if they're just taking care of themselves? And anyone can turn 60 or 80. That doesn't mean that they're an elder in the community. They're just an old person. They're not an elder. There's a spirituality to becoming an elder. And an elder is one who gives to the community, gives a gift to the community. And what elders are supposed to give are really wisdom. And I have to admit, I love this. I love the fact that we should have elders in our community. Now, here's the odd part. This is part of the ancient church. So if you read like Acts or the letter of Paul, you have all these ministries. Yes, you have bishops and priests and deacons, but look at all the other ministries you have. And one ministry is the order of widows. And here's the odd part. That was actually a ministry. So people at a certain time of age, the widows, are people who, actually there's a whole rite to it. It's a mass, and it really follows the consecration of virgins, that in the ancient church, there were people who were consecrated simply to give wisdom to the community. Isn't that amazing? You're not just old. Anyone can get old. But some people, their job is to give wisdom. And so if you read the ancient documents, the elderly, they're supposed to give this example of wisdom and stability. So like we have this, what's called seasons of hope for the people who are grieving the loss of a loved one. Secretly, I have to admit, what I want to do is move from season of hopes to having a consecratory mass for those who want to become elders. And that's a different type of wisdom that they're going to offer the community. Think about this as a progression of morality. That in the first phase of life, the first phase of life, if you're moral, you want to be a Boy Scout. The primary objective is just to follow the rules. That's a seminary game. I hate to say this, when you're in a seminary, you're proving that you're ready to be a priest because you can follow all the rules. Everything's black and white. But following the rules is good, but it really doesn't require grace. It doesn't even require God. You don't need, if you just follow the rules, you really don't even need God. Does that make any sense? And so, did I lose you on that? You don't really need God for that. This generative phase, that's a type of morality where you give your life away by all these responsibilities. That's Jesus doing all the ministries. He taught, he cared for people, he was running around. That was his generative phase. That's where most of us spend our lives. But the great sin is just to become a Martha, that you're resentful, that you're doing everything. Did you guys ever see the movie Jesus Christ Superstar? Okay, that scene where he's walking and all these lepers start just grabbing him constantly and he's like pushing him away? Do you remember that scene? No? That's how I feel most of my days. Like, guys, get away from me! You're being pulled in all these directions. And anyhow, you kind of feel resentful. But the last phase is that you're not really trying to run around doing everything. What you're offering the community is peace and wisdom. And from strength to strength, I really think that's a real gift. But here's the thing. A lot of it's boring. Stillness is boring. I told the story of the woman who didn't want to end being a stockbroker because it's more important to be important than happy. There's a certain spirituality of an elderly person, that they offer wisdom and example. And that sounds kind of strange, but this one woman, she was on this retreat, and she's an elderly woman, amazing, and it's supposed to be a silent retreat. And it wasn't silent. It was supposed to be this, moments of silence. And she says it was a women's retreat, but these young women kept coming to her for basically confession. And they wanted to talk about their lives to her. So she would break the silence and talk to him. And she says, there's 3 women who came up to her and said, I knew you wouldn't judge me. Well, I know this woman, she has really strong, deep values. But she also has this softness. And does that mean she has her values, but also gives this air of being non-judgmental because she gave her mistakes? I just think it's really interesting that this retreat needed an elderly woman who other ones could say, I knew you wouldn't judge me for this. Does that make any sense? Anyhow, the elder has this morality that's very non-judgmental, has values, very deep values that they won't bend on, but they give the vibe of not being judgmental. It kind of sounds strange, but like my nephews, they could tell their nana things that they wouldn't tell their mother, because I guarantee their mother would hit the ceiling. And I have to be honest, my mother would have hit the ceiling too. But I just think it's really interesting that in that little compound, when they were growing up, now they're all in the military, that they had this elder that they knew would never judge them. Does that mean, they knew their mother was devoted to them? But Nana had a different one. My sister would have saw everything as right and wrong. Nana just listens. I just think it's interesting that the early church had consecrated widows who their job was to give wisdom. And when you're older, you can have your values plus incredible humility, which makes room for truth and being non-judgmental. It's not telling people if somebody has a problem, well, let me tell you what the catechism says. That's not what an elder does. An elder can give morality without condemnation. And that phase is this radical discipleship. The radical discipleship is this sense of home. And T.S. Eliot said about home that home is where you start from and where you return to for the first time. And spiritual journey begins at puberty, where you leave home, but the last phase of life is not when you leave home, it's when your present creates a home. So we should be that ready for the journey of becoming home. The last phase of life, as I said, is not when you do anything. The last phase is not the powers of eros that drive you and your weaknesses. It's actually giving our death away, preparing our community to be this new type of home. So Henry Nouwen says, there comes a time in life where you stop asking questions. What can I do to contribute to life? But the question becomes, how can I live now that my death, my going away, will be a blessing for my family and my world? He says, the question is, how is the best way to die? It moves away from how can I be a better mother, how can I be a better boss or engineer, so that how can my last phase of life leave a blessing to other people? That's an elder. That's not an old person. That's an elder. So he says, death can either be a failure, in the sense that a failure because you're just clinging, trying to avoid death, or he said, depending on death, can be seen as a sense of hope, where, okay, if it's the last phase of life, why not live it in peace and stillness? Why not be an example for other people? He says, you can make the choice what kind of death you're going to have. And the clearest distinction is that Jesus gave his life during his ministry, but his last phase is giving us his death. So the generative phase, Jesus goes around really from Galilee to Jerusalem, and all he does is teach and teach and teach. But then in the last chapters, Jesus gives his death away. And if you notice, in the Greek, all the verbs change to the passive in the last phase of his life. The first part of the gospel, Jesus does things for other people. The verbs are active. He feeds, he cures, he teaches, he leads them. But then, when you get to the last couple chapters, all the verbs change to the passive. Starting on Holy Thursday, everything is passive. They put ropes on him. They led him. They crucified him. Many think that, like the Passion of Christ, when it says passion, you think of intense suffering, but actually the Passion of Christ is his passivity. He became patient. Patient comes from the word passive. When they put ropes around him, he's checking into palliative care. So Nouwen says that he came to this man's bedside who was dying of cancer, and the man was a very devout Catholic from a large family, successful business, and the man says, my entire life I've been in charge. I took care of my family, I took care of my business, I took care of the parish, and he says, now I'm helpless. They bring me bedpans. And so Nouwen said he just sat by the man's bed and read him the Passion. He said the man picked up that it was all passive verbs. And he says, if I have this cancer, I guess my job is to give an example of peace to my children. And so that's what I mean, where an elder is not trying to change the world through teaching and ministry. It's becoming something. Or there's this story called You Have No Power Over Me, where the story is about somebody who has cancer, but the cancer no longer has power over them. He says, now I get what Christ meant. Being God, having all the power, Christ became very passive. Think about this. In the Passion of Christ, God, he could have done anything. But what he gives is a type of freedom that shows victory not by confrontation, not by arguing, but by being something. And so the centurion comes up and throws the lance into his side, pierces his heart, and all this blood gets on the soldier. But blood and water comes out of his heart, but blood and water are a type of birth. And as Roman Catholics, we're very quick to jump to the conclusion that the blood and the water are the sacramental signs of baptism and Eucharist, and that is true, they are. But remember, the first symbol of blood and water is a new birth. That's a primary image. Child comes into life through blood and water. Christ's death literally comes through blood and water. And so my point being is that, think of that as an analogy, that the last phase of our life should also, like Christ's death, be a birth. And this is what I mean by an elder. So I'm going to take the example of Sarah and Abraham. So, when Abraham gets the call from God to leave everything behind, to journey to a land you've never seen, Abraham was 80. Sarah was 70. And God didn't immediately tell him about the baby. God tells him to set out for a land you won't know where you're going, but don't worry, I know where you're going. Well, I don't know if I like that. But think about that. You can't tell that to somebody who's in their 20s. Don't worry, I know where I'm going. I'm not going to tell you, they want to know the GPS. It's the elderly that can surrender and say, okay, they can be passive. And the journey takes 20 years. So when Abraham is 100 and Sarah is 90, God tells them Sarah will be pregnant. And every 90-year-old wants to be pregnant. But, I was being funny, but think of the great irony. What the hell is going on here? No, seriously. That saying your last pregnancy will happen when you're in your gray hair, it's a different type of pregnancy. Setting out for a land that you don't know, that you won't be coming back, but don't worry, I'll be there. That's the last phase of life. And inside this is a type of pregnancy that will give life to future generations. It's not the act of life. So 90-year-olds normally don't get pregnant. 90-year-olds, women, they don't give, 90-year-old women don't get pregnant that often, right? But 90-year-old women do give birth in a much different way than imagined. That's the point of this story, that this elderly couple gave birth to religion in a way that, a 20-year-old can't. So what I mean by that is, like I told you a story about this priest who, in his hometown, his mother was dying. So on his day off, his mother and him would just go driving. And she said to him, I've given up being afraid because I've lost it all. I've lost my looks, I've lost my husband, I've lost my teeth, my hair, my eyesight. I've lost it all. So I feel really free for the first time in my life. And he said those remaining months with his mother is when she gave birth to him from above. When he was a child, she gave birth to him below, his earthly life. But he said, my mother gave me the last few months with my mother, she gave me birth from above. She gave me a whole new way to see the world. I was envious of this priest. He said her sense of peace and freedom, it gave me a whole new birth. Or Bradley Cooper, the actor, he said that about his father's death. That his father was, growing up was very powerful and in charge. And he said his father's death, I can't remember what disease it was not this horrific tragedy, but his father's death he described as a whole new beginning for Bradley Cooper, a whole new way of seeing the world. That's what elderly do. So like Abraham and Sarah, they may be at the end of their lives, but that's the part where religion got born. So think about this. Religion didn't start with a young, vibrant couple. Monotheism begins with this elderly couple who are fine not being in charge. God tells them, you're going to go on a journey, but I'm not going to tell you. You'll just have to listen. Does that make sense? Like, that's not somebody in the proficiency phase of taking care of everything. That's somebody who's still. So religion was born by somebody who could be still. Religion was born by a couple who could trust. Religion was born in the Bible from an elderly couple. So in the ancient church, they had these consecrated people who would not just be old, they're consecrated to be elders. I was going to read some stuff, but now I'm going to stop because I've gone for almost an hour. But does that make sense where, going over this, like the last phase of life should be this generative phase where you become, I think it takes a couple years, Abraham and Sarah. You're not trying to be in charge and conquer the world. It's a different type of birth. And I really do think the same way we initiate people from becoming from childhood into adulthood, I also think there should be initiations from being old into becoming an elder. So that's my class on spirituality of aging. Questions, objections? Well, that was pretty easy. Yes, Paula Morano. I'm only using one eye. Do systems evolve? I don't know. But do you know Arthur Brooks, who wrote From Strength to Strength? He's given this talk to some startup company. And the startup company has all the, these young 20-year-olds computers. And he says, you're concerned to make sure there's a certain percentage of women, certain percentage of this. He says, but you know what your company's missing? Elderly. That they have a different way of viewing at life. And he does this whole thing on his economic podcast, is that on the importance of having elderly in a business, because sometimes the business might have the latest machinery and all this other stuff, but they lack the wisdom to say, is this a smart thing we're doing? So, like, I just think in politics, you need a lot of people in their generative phase, but you also need some people who are elders. And if systems are going to change, this sounds kind of strange, like the Catholic Church. That's why I really wish it would return to consecrating elders. Because I think, like, think of this, like the priest who wants to control the story, like he has all these rules and regulations. Does that make sense? Shouldn't there be some elderly person who says, you know, that's what you think is in one phase of your life where you're controlling everything, but shouldn't there be some elderly people who can say, there'll come a point in your life, you want to stop trying to control everybody and you want it to become a home. Do you know what I mean? Like my mother, who's a very, very devout Catholic, in her home parish, the priest there is a good priest. I know him. He's a good priest. But he wants to be in control of everything. And now that drives Nana up a wall. Because it's no longer about what's really important, which is the community and the sense of belonging. Does that make sense? Like she wants that for her children and others. But the priest is more concerned to make sure all the paperwork is done correctly. So I think systems need people of wisdom. And the only way you can gain wisdom if you're John the Cross is in the dark night of the soul, where you really lost it all. Like, I don't want to be in charge anymore. So yeah, I think systems need the elderly. Systems don't need old people. Yeah, that's what I was, like, actually, though, I would challenge that. Paul doesn't say older women. He says elders. That's who needs to give their wisdom and their truth. Like, the woman who was on the retreat, the younger women went to her because they felt that she would be non-judgmental. So, like Paula, yeah, I think this church, it needs elders. It needs. So, anyhow, it's just whether people would listen to their elders. That's, anyhow. All right, hopefully that wasn't too confusing. And next class, I think, is going to be on, and this, it's not really an education class, but I want to be up front. Like, and I'll probably do this every year. Like, I always want to look at, like, where do I want to take the parish? What direction do I want to take the parish? Because you can run a parish in a lot of different ways. And if you're going to choose a direction, it means, well, there's certain things I'm not going to do because I don't want to spend my energy on that. Not that they're bad. Does that make any sense? So I kind of thought we'd just have an adult ed class where I'll tell you where I want to go with the parish. So that's our next one, but I forget when it is because I don't remember things. So, all right, God bless. And Craig, next time, check them.